Good morning. Welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'm Kim McClary, President and CEO, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to today's program. Please stay tuned to the end of today's program for a brief update on our upcoming programs. And for those of you who would like to ask questions today, there's a control panel on the right-hand side of your screen where you can type in your questions. Jessica DeGanzik, our Vice President of Events, will be managing your questions during the Q&A portion of today's program, which should start in about 30 or 35 minutes. Today, we are pleased to welcome award-winning journalist and widely known foreign correspondent Marvin Kalb. This program is presented in partnership with Savalier's Bookstore. Marvin joined us today as he's just published his memoir, Assignment Russia, Becoming a Foreign Correspondent in the Crucible of the Cold War. A quick reference point for our viewers, Marvin was chosen by the legendary broadcaster Edward R. Murrow to become one of what was known as the Murrow Boys, who were CBS radio broadcast journalists most closely associated with Edward R. Murrow during his time at the network, most notably in the years before and during World War II. Moderating today's conversation is John Emerson, Chairman of the American Council on Germany. He's Vice Chairman of Capital Group International and former U.S. Ambassador to Germany. John, it's so great to have you back moderating with us again, and we can't wait for today's conversation.
Oh, thanks so much, Kim, and thanks for having me. And Marvin, thank you so much for joining us. I think I speak for many of those who are Zooming in today or webbing in, whatever the verb is, that many of us grew up watching your extraordinary reporting over the years, and it's just a real honor and a real pleasure to be with you.
Well, you're very, very kind to say that, John. It is my pleasure to be with you and the World Affairs Council and Town Hall, who are sponsoring this, and fire away.
All right, fantastic. Well, first of all, let me just show everybody what we're talking about here. I'm gonna make sure I get it in the right. Yeah, yes. Assignment Russia. Here's the book, and
believe
hopefully
it
we'll have a link.
The same guy, about 60 some odd years ago.
It's good looking. Anyway, so well, let's just start. I mean, Kim mentioned it. I mean, you were hired by the legendary reporter Edward R. Murrow. You really cut your teeth during the glory days of broadcast radio and the beginning of broadcast news in terms of television. Names like Trout, Townsend, Kuralt, Cronkite, on and on. These were the names that I grew up with, were your colleagues. Why don't you talk a little bit about that? And I'll tell you what really struck me. Two things that struck me. One was how thoughtful the newscasting was in terms of truly informing the public, and how much work and research went into a 1 minute and 30-second report, really letting people know what was happening in Russia, or what was, wherever it was. And then the second thing that struck me was your anecdote about how Edward R. Murrow sort of handled his television appearances. So maybe talk about both those things, if you would.
Well, that's a lot, and I'll try to do the best I can. I was a graduate student going for a PhD in Russian history, and pretty well set in a career as a scholar. The New York Times asked me to do a magazine piece on Soviet youth, and that was in May of 1957. I did that piece. Murrow read it, liked it, and called me on Monday morning at Widener Library. And I didn't take his call because I thought he must be some quack trying to call me, because Murrow would not be calling me. But he called back a second time, and the librarian all but insisted that I pick up the phone, and I did. And the minute I heard his voice, which was so distinctive, I felt like a total jackass, because how could I have offended this man. It's terrible. But he said, forget all of that. Can you come down and talk to me? New York, yes, of course, went there. Secretary said a half hour. Murrow asked questions for 3 hours. And that's sort of indicative of what you were getting at, John, earlier, the seriousness with which he and his colleagues approached the study of any subject before they felt they had a right to talk to the American people about that subject. And so we talked for 3 hours about Russia, every aspect of Soviet youth. Khrushchev, who was at that time the leader of the Soviet Union. Murrow said, by the way, putting his arm around me, he said, how would you like to join CBS? And that was the end of my academic career, and I joined immediately. I was so thrilled, really, to be a part of a new world for me. I had really considered my life to be that of a teacher, and suddenly this great man was offering me a job. And that was clearly because he felt I spoke Russian, I was teaching Russian history, going for a PhD, that I was a serious guy, and maybe this kind of person would work at CBS.
My
When I
understanding
joined, I
is
was
your parents weren't too excited about that decision, though.
well, no, well, my mother was not. She insisted that I finish my degree first because she was right that I would be so absorbed in what I was doing that I really wouldn't go back and finish it up. And my father, on the other hand, was go for it. I mean, he was very excited about the idea. But when I joined CBS in June of 1957, I was very much the kid on the block. And you mentioned all of these extraordinary journalists who were there. And because I was brought in by Murrow and regarded as his guy, I was clearly on an upward trajectory rather quickly. And they had me write analysis pieces for radio, then television pieces and documentaries. And I was fully, I had my eye on being the Moscow correspondent for CBS, and that happened in May of 1960. And I can tell you that for me, I was I was sort of raised to read a lot before you open up your mouth. And what Murrow was saying, in effect, as he was sort of um, um, carrying me along on this path, because I knew nothing about broadcasting. I didn't know anything about taking pictures with a 16 millimeter camera, of sticking a microphone in front of somebody. This was all new to me. What Murrow kept on saying was, this is all the technology. At the end, it's what you say that matters. And what you say has to be something you are fully comfortable saying, meaning that you've checked it out as carefully as you could. And when you say it, level with the people, you really know this, this is the sourcing, or I'm kind of guessing, going along with you on this. And that stuck in my mind, and I have a feeling that that is not I have a feeling, I'm certain that that is not the way contemporary journalism works.
Not
Um,
remotely, I'm afraid. And then of course we have everybody's an expert, and true expertise is disdained by so many now in society. And with the social media and the 24/7 news cycle, all of those things, I think it's suffered a lot. You did mention that Edward R. Murrow was somewhat skeptical of television, even though he was one of the first real users of that medium from the standpoint of broadcast news. Share us with us a little bit about that.
well, Murrow was aware of the power of television. He was never quite aware that he was the guy to do it, although he was clearly. But there was in this rather great man, which is what he was, um, a deep inside modesty about whether he really could measure up to what people thought he was. And when he was doing radio, well before we got into television, even then he was concerned because how did I know that? The first time he allowed me into the studio with him, Studio 9 in New York, I watched him as he was broadcasting and his feet were bouncing up and down. He had opened up his fly all the way down because he didn't want any pressure on his stomach. And I could see the perspiration forming around him. This was radio. Nobody was seeing him. The remarkable thing was, salute. The remarkable thing was that his voice, if you just listened, his voice was as steady, calm as can be. On television, when the perspiration would start, the minute he would go into a commercial break, the key secretary who was with him all the time, even starting in London, she would run up with a handkerchief and get rid of all of the perspiration. And when he came back, it was clean, but then it would start again. And his shirt down below would be absolutely drenched when he was finished.
That reminds me of Albert Brooks in that movie Broadcast News.
Yes. But this was true. They probably got that right from
I bet you're
right. Radio and television grew up in that era. Radio had already been there. Television was new, and it was incredibly exciting. It really was. And for somebody who was there at the very beginning, there were odd things that would excite you. For example, because you were recognizable, you'd go into a restaurant and you could get a table. Or those small things. You get on an airplane, hey, Mr. Cow, would you like to be in first class? It was obvious, yes. So those were wonderful things that went along with television. The negative side was we knew as it was happening at the very beginning that many times, truly, we were not prepared, so that a lot of what was said on camera by the correspondent. So you had a lot of conversation among a lot of important people, a lot of conversation. Murrow had a program called Small World. At the very beginning, he would invite people from Europe, from Japan. That was based on an assumption that the technology could support it. Today, the technology can support anything. When Murrow went into Buchenwald in April of 1945, he looked at what was there and it so stunned him that when he went back to his hotel that night, he got himself boozed up, and because he couldn't quite absorb the horror of what he had seen, and he knew he could not broadcast anything that night, and the next, it was only the third day afterward that Murrow told you what he had seen 3 days before. Today, the journalist walks into a Buchenwald type story and just talks.
Yeah.
And that's live, and the difference is profound, just profound. And
That
that's
is
just a difference between the two.
That's a great observation. Really, and kind of sad in a way that we've come to that place. But let me, I had all these questions prepared, but just to kind of continue the conversation, your comment about Buchenwald, which, of course, as ambassador, I was there during the 70th anniversary of the liberation of Buchenwald, with a number of the survivors of that time. But it makes me remember to a different time in German history, the height of the Cold War. So you were in Moscow for very important periods of time during the Cold War. My first time on the other side of the Iron Curtain was in 1975 when I just graduated from college, going to Berlin and having the opportunity with one of my professors who happened to be the head of Aspen Institute Berlin at the time to go into the former East, and was just struck by the difference. Maybe share with some folks what life, even for a journalist, was like being in Moscow in the 1960s?
Well, let me take you back just a little bit. I lived in Moscow during the Cold War for about 5 years. The first of those years was in 1956. And I did a book about that. I was very absorbed with that year because it was a big year in Russian history. Khrushchev had attacked the legend,
Right.
Joseph Stalin, which sent electric currents through the entire communist world. It was a big, big story. From that period on until 1964, when Khrushchev was kicked out of power, Russia was in a moment of hopeful anticipation because Khrushchev was the kind of communist dictator. While he believed fundamentally in communism, he could see that it wasn't as good as he himself said, and it could be reformed and become better. And in anticipating a question that may come up later, Putin today is doing exactly the opposite with Russia. He is taking the Russia that he found and crushing the spirit of the Russian people as best he can. But in those years of the Cold War, as a reporter, I tried very hard because I spoke Russian quite well and I made it my business as often as possible, every day, to get into the street, to go to a marketplace, simply to talk to Russians. Not to ask them about Berlin or Cuba or anything, just talk to them. What's it like today? What should I be buying today? And they would rush to tell me, don't buy that, it's no good. But buy this because we got a lot of it. And that gave me also indications of what was good in agriculture, what couldn't be produced. And I had a feel, I thought I had a feel anyway, for what the Russian people might be thinking then about larger questions. I found that the Russian people were at that time 10 to 15 years after the end of World War II. The setting here is crucial, John. It was so soon after the end of World War II when upwards of 20 to 40 million Russians died during that war. We still don't know the exact number. But any leader of the Soviet Union, and I got to talk to Khrushchev a good bit, one, because I spoke Russian, two, because I was sort of lucky. I was in the right place at the right time. And I had this feeling about him, even as we got into the midst of the Berlin crisis, followed by the Cuban Missile Crisis, that this was a Russian leader who, as I said before, totally dedicated to communism, but aware that it isn't working quite the way we wanted it to work, and we have to reform the system. He also profoundly believed that war must be avoided.
Mm-hmm.
He could be reckless, as he was with Cuba. He could play games. He could carry the world to the brink of, but I never believed for an instant that in his mind, he was ready to fight a war. And after Cuba, I'm just actually in the middle of starting to write the Cuba chapter of this next memoir I'm doing. Somebody came over to him after, and I think it was Mikoyan, and asked him, Nikita Sergeyevich, were you scared during the Cuban Missile Crisis? Were you scared there'd be a war? And Khrushchev looked at him and said, yes, I was scared. Only an idiot wouldn't be scared.
Mm-hmm.
And then he went on to say, John, a phrase that really stuck deep with me. Khrushchev said, only the living would envy the dead in a nuclear war. The living would envy the dead. And that was the kind of leader, and he performed in this way too, who would carry his interests to the utmost. But when he sensed that you were at that brink He had the courage to pull back. And because he had the courage to pull back in Cuba, he lost his job 18 months later, kicked out of office.
Interesting. I hadn't realized that that one had led to the other. That's really well. We can't wait to read your next book when you get into that. Well, let's talk a little bit about. You've talked about him in terms of. I mean, given us a lot of insight in terms of him and his character. But two things. Number one, I think you're probably the only American journalist who have been given a nickname by Nikita Khrushchev. It'd be interesting for that story. But also, I was struck. There was a crucial time in Paris where you wanted to get. You were breaking a story and you wanted to get it from the horse's mouth. And as I recall, you basically showed up at the place where he was staying. It might have been the embassy, I don't remember which, or it might have just been a place they were renting. And he went out for a morning walk, and you just walked right up and started interviewing him. Which, can you imagine that happening today with? Anyway, let's share with us a little bit about all that.
Well, the first story was July 4th, 1956, at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. Actually, at Spaso House, where the ambassador lived.
Oh, sure.
And we were having a very big celebration, and Ambassador Bolin, who was a superb ambassador, really had a wonderful party. The night before, Khrushchev sent a message to the ambassador saying he wanted to be there himself with his Politburo. That was a big deal. That was a big gesture on his part. And the ambassador called the three other people at the embassy who spoke Russian. This is an interesting point too, that in 1956, 4 people at the embassy spoke Russian, that's all.
Wow.
Today, most of the people at the embassy
speak Russian. You don't get to go there unless you've gone to the foreign service.
Exactly, so much better now, so much better. But there I was, one of them, and the kid on the block. And so Ambassador Bolin said, you are going to be responsible for looking after Marshal Zhukov, who was the Minister of Defense. And the picture of him is a guy about 5'6" in height and width, with his chest completely surrounded by medals. And I thought that was a bit absurd because I had been a PFC in the US Army. Being a host to a marshal of the Soviet Army is sort of crazy, but that was my job. So I did it, and we walked around for a half hour talking, having a good time. He socked back 8 vodkas. I counted them, 8 in a half hour. It's unbelievable. I socked back 8 waters in a half hour. And then he took me over to see Khrushchev. And Khrushchev looked up at me, and Marshal Zhukov said, I have finally found a young American who can drink like a Russian. Khrushchev loved that. So he came over and he said, how tall are you? To this day, John, I have no idea why I gave this answer, but I did. I said, I'm 3 centimeters shorter than Peter the Great. Khrushchev listened to that, burst into laughter, thought that was the funniest line he'd had in a long time. And he began to call me Peter the Great, which was terrific because as a reporter, when you had to get through that initial barrier set up by the security people, and Khrushchev would see me, he would say, let him through, because he's okay, he's Peter the Great. And I got a couple of really good stories like that. One of them was the one you mentioned in Paris. This is May 1960. Berlin is the hot story. Khrushchev wanted very much to sit down with President Eisenhower. And in his, I think, slightly naive, romantic mind, if he could sit down with an American president, he was certain he could solve any question in the world. Ridiculous, but that was in his mind. However, as Khrushchev was coming into Paris, Eisenhower into Paris, Harold Macmillan of Great Britain, Charles de Gaulle already there. Earlier by 2 weeks, the United States had sent a U-2 spy plane over the Soviet Union It was shot down. Miraculously, the plane more or less kept in one piece, and the pilot saved. And Khrushchev had in his hand both a propaganda weapon against the United States, but also a terrible humiliation and embarrassment. So when we all arrived in Paris on May 14, 1960, it was not clear at that time whether there would actually be a summit. But the leaders arrived believing that if Khrushchev would come to Paris, there would have to be a summit. What would be the point of his coming? In the CBS preparation for covering the summit the night before, I knew I was responsible for covering Khrushchev, but when you're covering a communist leader, you can't get up to that guy that easily. So I was thinking to myself, I knew that every time Khrushchev traveled abroad, he would get up very early and take a walk. And in those days, John, before the terrorist threat that we live with today so intimately, it was not unusual for a Soviet leader or a French leader, somebody to take a walk. So I persuaded the foreign editor at CBS. I said, give me a crew and I will get there first thing in the morning at 6 a.m. And if he shows up, we might have something. If he doesn't, what have we got to lose? Well, he didn't want to give me a crew. And then David Schomburg, who was our Paris correspondent, said, let's not be ridiculous. Give him my crew. Take it. I was there at 6 o'clock the next day. 6:30, these big iron doors at the embassy still remained shut. My crew getting antsy. 7 o'clock, exactly. Big iron doors open. Khrushchev emerges with two bodyguards, looks one way down the street, the other way. And I saw him, he saw me, and I started moving right toward him when his two bodyguards stepped in front of me, reached into their jacket pocket, I assumed, not for candy. And Khrushchev, understanding what was happening immediately, said, no, 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 it's Peter the Great. Leave him alone. He's fine. And with that introduction, I had the crew right there. We walked down the street. I was chattering away with him, and we got to a boulangerie at the end of the block. Gorgeous aroma of freshly baked croissant coming out into the street, wafting into the street. And I could say Khrushchev was kind of tickled by what he was sniffing. And I said, Mr. Chairman, have you ever tasted a freshly baked croissant? So
Wow.
would you like it? Yes. I ran in and got a bunch of them, gave one to him. He bit into it, his face lit up. A kid at Christmas. He was having a great time, chewing away on it, went into a second one. And then I had my interview and I went right at him then on Berlin. And he looked at me and then he knew he was on. He was an actor. Khrushchev was an actor. When he saw the camera, he put on a performance. His performance with me was, you cannot humiliate me. You cannot violate our sovereign borders and expect me to arrive here and do exactly what you want? No. I said, so there won't be a summit? He said, I didn't say that. I said, will there be a summit? We will see. He was playing games, but he established that the United States would have to apologize. The United States would have to promise never to fly U-2 type aircraft over the Soviet Union, and it would have to fire the people responsible. Now, that's hardly something that Eisenhower could have done, but Eisenhower wanting some kind of conversation to get going, he let the word go out to Khrushchev privately that even if we don't have a formal summit, I am here and I'm prepared to sit down and talk to you and we can discuss anything you want. And at that moment, Khrushchev had a terribly important decision to make. In my judgment, he made a profoundly wrong decision, but he said no to Eisenhower. And for Ike, that was the end of it. He would not talk to him again because he had bent over backwards, in his judgment, to accommodate Khrushchev, and Khrushchev would not go along with it. So the summit, which wasn't really a summit, ended that next day, and we all went back to our home bases.
What a great story. And just I am also struck in reading the book with your how you recount these stories. Your memory must be just extraordinary because you have every little detail and the flowers in the vase kind of thing. I mean, it's just very very impressive and riveting. Parts of it read like a great novel, I must say.
But John, I have to quickly explain that. There are a couple of things. At that time in my life, I was still essentially a graduate student. I took notes on everything. And so I had notes, I had records of what happened back then. I've also been blessed with a wonderful memory. And the two kind of come together. So when I'm sitting down to write something, the minute I begin to think again of what was like on the Rue de Grenelle, there was the embassy, the doors were opening, and suddenly I'm back there again.
That's great.
So I can see it in my mind's eye, and that helps me describe it. It is certainly not fiction, I can assure you. It is.
Well, what I meant that I only meant that in the sense that it reads so beautifully, and
Well,
you
that is a
your
compliment.
mind's eye, you let us into your mind's eye, which is fantastic. I have one more question, and then we're going to go to Jessica. So everybody out there who's listening to this, if you have questions, use the Q&A or chat function or whatever. Get them to Jessica, and we'll go to audience questions in a minute. But a big portion of your book is devoted to your, at the time, groundbreaking judgment and research into the reality of a Soviet-Sino split, which at the time everybody just assumed that, including experts, that communism was this sort of global monolithic thing, and you sense, well, no, there's some real differences here between where the Soviets are coming from and where the Chinese, where Mao Zedong and the Chinese are coming from, and I was going to ask you to not only speak a little bit about that, but almost to bring it to the present day, because of course one of our geopolitical concerns today is that Russia and Putin and Xi Jinping are working together, obviously, in ways to sort of confound the West or break up the alliances, et cetera. So I'd just love your insight on that, and then we'll go to Jessica afterwards for some
Sure.
Q&A for the audience.
John, as you remember, at that particular time, in the mid 1950s into the 60s, communist China was a relatively new arrival on the block, so to speak. 1949 was the Chinese Communist Revolution. I'm talking about starting in 1956, in other words, only 6 or 7 years later. One of the things that I noticed, which was quite fascinating, I used to read the Chinese and Russian press every day just to get a sense of what the official line was. Khrushchev, on February 24th, 1956, attacks Joseph Stalin. Huge story all over the world, couldn't miss it. In the Chinese press, for 5 months, there is not any reference to it at all. It is as if it never happened. And I was asking myself a question. If I were Mao Zedong, and I had just observed that my equivalent, Joseph Stalin, had just been ripped over the coals by a number 2 guy like Khrushchev, is that possible that that might happen here? And so he got a little antsy about the way in which the Soviet Union, the motherland of global communism, suddenly was being run by this pipsqueak #2 guy, Khrushchev. He had the guts to take on Stalin. Who in China has the guts to take on me, Mao? So there was something big that had been happening. Did I know it for a fact? Absolutely not. It was something. But I joined CBS in June of 1957. In 1958, the Chinese launched something called the Great Leap Forward. That was based on an ideological assumption that the world communist movement would be led by peasants. Because in China, it did not have a proletarian movement, it had a peasant movement. However, in Russia, everything was based on the old Marxist idea that the communist revolution would come after a proletarian revolution, an industrial revolution. That was fundamental communist ideology and a big difference. And that was developing throughout 1958. In 59, I was so attracted to this story that I asked CBS for a year off, which that also was rather remarkable, and that also, I'm sure, was Murrow's doing. But they gave me a year off, and I took half of that year to travel around the world to find out what expert opinion was saying about the strength of this alliance, because I saw evidence of the beginning of a fracturing apart. But the State Department didn't agree. The big shots up at the Russian Research Center at Harvard didn't agree. At the Russian Institute of Columbia didn't agree. The State Department didn't agree. But I had my research, and I did a book which came out in '62 called Dragon in the Kremlin, where the image of this giant from China slipping into the Kremlin and in effect undercutting the proper line on communism. And the alliance at that time, in the fall of 1960, Khrushchev had a meeting of leaders of the communist parties all over the world. And in Moscow at that time, obviously they didn't invite any foreign correspondents, but you could talk to these people. The Chinese wouldn't talk to us, but the Italian communists would, French communists would, German communists did. So we had sources who would tell us what was going on. And what was going on was an outright collision of interest between the Russian and the Chinese. And so I felt justified in having spent so much time on this one story, because I thought it was so important that we get that story right. Now, picking up, John, the contemporary side of it, that was a time when the Sino-Soviet alliance was fracturing apart. What we have now is not the beginning of an alliance. The national interests of both China and Russia remain essentially in collision, but for one thing. They both, and they're not the only ones in the world who feel this way, but they both feel that the United States is in a period of decline. And when the United States is in a period of decline, when it's down, and we can do it together better than we can separately. Mm-hmm. So even though both will pursue their own national interest, in this particular case, because of a common vision of an American decline, they are prepared to cooperate. But I wouldn't bet money that that's going to go on for a long time. This is a reason having to do with today.
Yeah, well, that's a very powerful observation, particularly as we look at things today. All right, Jessica, do you have any questions that you would like to throw at Mr. Cal?
Yeah, well, I mean, such incredible life stories. I'm trying to figure out when they're going to make this into a film and who's going to play Peter the Great. So we'll have to think about that a bit more.
I think George Clooney was who Marvin had in mind.
All right, George Clooney it is. Before we launch into the Q&A session, I would like to thank our members and viewers for your continued support. We depend upon your donations and membership to cover our expenses so that we can continue to bring you these great live discussions. So if you are able to make a donation, please go to our website, lawacth.org, and click on the donate button or become a member. We greatly appreciate your support. All right, let's jump into these questions. Having had the chance to see so much change occur in Russia over your career, do you see the current regime as any more or less damaging than past regimes to Russia in the long term?
Well, yes, yes, I do. And the reason for that is that during Khrushchev's time, I stressed before, Khrushchev was a devoted communist. There was no question in his mind about the wonders of communism. However, he recognized that it's not as good as we promote it, and we ought to begin to reform the system. And in 1956, running through some but not all of his tenure through 1964, he did begin to introduce elements of freedom. You could begin to read certain books you were not able to read before. You could begin to see foreign artists come into the Soviet Union and perform. That would never have happened in Stalin's time. You could begin to travel to foreign countries. In other words, you could get a tourist visa somewhere. Never would have happened before. What is happening now with Putin? For every single one of Khrushchev's opening gestures, Putin is now closing it down. And in every single way, even an organization called Memorial, which is a group put together to try to keep alive the idea of human rights and individual freedom, and to pay their respects to great people, writers, artists. Right now, each one, Memorial itself today, is being shut down by Putin. That to me is the sign not of a strong leader, even a dictator, no. It's the sign of a weakening leader, someone who appreciates the fact that the way he's governing this country is not working well at all. But he will not accept that in any way as an overt expression of policy or appearance or the way in which Russia is supposed to look to the outside world. So it's an interesting fact today. I think the number in the ballpark roughly, there are about 450 well-known political prisoners in prison today. In the worst times of the Soviet period, there were 46 well-known political prisoners. In other words, the definition has widened, and he is applying that to an awful lot of people. So Putin, in my judgment, is the boss, no question about it, but he's in a weaker position than he has ever been in.
We have several people asking after Putin, what do you think comes next? What do the Russians want? And then what, I guess, is the regime heading towards?
Well, I have always believed that the Russian people are a gifted people, and they deserve an opportunity to show their talent to the rest of the world. In some of the worst times in the Tsarist period in Russian history, you would have great writers, you had great composers, you had great mathematicians. Can you imagine going to a concert today without hearing a Russian piece of some sort, or be in a school and do something on world literature and not be reading Tolstoy, Pushkin, Dostoevsky? Of course. The country is rich with talent, but has never been rich in opportunities for individual freedom And so whenever there's been a blip upward, it gets crushed. And the same kind of thing that Putin is doing now. I hope sincerely that the Russian people will be given an opportunity, maybe not immediately after Putin, but maybe a decade or two down the road, where some Russian who believes in individual freedom will come into power. Gorbachev, for example, was close to doing that. And he never quite had the power to push it through. And the bad guys beat him up bad, which is what bad guys do.
Yeah. In your time covering the USSR, how much did you and other observers realize that the Soviet control over the non-Russian nationalities was weak?
Well, we didn't believe that it was weak at the time. We knew that it was different. One of my professors at Harvard named Richard Pipes, a marvelous scholar, very conservative in his views, and he worked in the Reagan administration for a couple of years. Pipes believed, based on the studies that he did of what were called the National, not Liberation Front, the National, I can't think of the right word here. But if you took a look at the totality of the Soviet Union, let's say in the time that I was there from mid-50s to mid-60s, there were 102 different nationalities all over the Soviet Union. Biggest one, obviously, was Russian. The second was Ukrainian. And the third was Belarusian. And then Tashkent, then Uzbekistan. And so you had lots of smaller groups all over the country, but the Russians ran it all. It was their empire. No question about that. We all knew that these were national movements, national identities, not movements, national identities. And some of them, I mean, for example, Mikoyan, who was one of the closest aides to Stalin, was an Armenian. And what did that mean? That meant that he came from one of the Soviet republics. The minute the Soviet Union itself disintegrated at the end of 1990, at that time, 5 countries suddenly sprouted up in Central Asia. They had been there before as national identities, but not as nations. And then Georgia popped up, and Armenia popped up, and Ukraine, the biggest prize of them all, popped up. And so in the midst of the Cold War, we did not give enough attention to the national identity of these various people. We knew they were there, but we didn't think of them as breaking away. We missed that. It was a big story and we blew it because the minute centralized Russian control died, they broke away instantly on their own. And Russia today is a country of 143 million. Before the breakup of the Soviet Union, it was a country of 287 million. That's a big, big difference.
Yeah. Interesting. Thank you. This questioner says,
thank you.
Yes, thank you, James. Thank you so much for your incredible work and integrity. What would you recommend Americans do now to heal our democracy, and how can we be most helpful to the Russian people?
That's 2 very big,
very different questions. Yeah,
very different, but maybe there's a commonness in them too. Let me first address the America side of that question, and that has nothing to do with Russia assignment. It has nothing truly to do with Russia. It has to do with what is happening in this country now. I mentioned before that Russia and China come together today on one central element, their vision that their principal adversary, the United States of America, is in decline. That is what they believe. To make that judgment worse than it sounds, there are many, many Americans living here right now, and you're listening to one of them, who also believes that the country is in decline. I would go one step further. I believe that the United States right now is sliding, and I use that verb advisedly, it is sliding toward an authoritarian form of government. Things are happening in this country today which are shocking, which seem to be, to use an old-fashioned Marxist word, it's un-American what is happening today, but it's happening. It's all over the place. And to go into a university today and not be able to express your views because it collides with the judgment of another group, that's not American. At least in my judgment, you should be able at a university to say anything you want and then argue about it. But don't say that one is wrong and cannot express his view. That is simply wrong, and it's frightening, and that is happening in this country today. And we must face that. And I think those of us who might agree with what I'm saying must be more involved in somehow or other fighting that. May I go on for 30 seconds?
Please.
I have the weirdest idea, which I will advance publicly. Liz Cheney is a congressperson from Wyoming, right? She recently was kicked out of the leadership of the Republican Party. The other day, she made a very interesting speech in a most interesting spot in New Hampshire, of all places, New Hampshire, in which she ripped into Trump and ripped into the leadership of the Republican Party around Trump. She named names. She was as bold as can be. She's running next year in the congressional elections. Trump is putting money and effort into defeating her. Let us say for a second that she wins. Let us say for a second that Cheney beats this public Trump-supported effort to kick her out of power, and she remains in power, triumphant in her judgment that Trump and the people around him are wrong. She becomes then, this is the twinkle in my eye, she becomes then, because she's got 2 years to plan then, if she wins in 2022, looking to a 2024, she could begin to think about the reason she went to New Hampshire this week, because she's thinking of the presidency. And if she was to use the 2022 to 2024 idea, that time frame to build up support, she would then test the proposition that I believe lies at the heart of a legitimate way of turning America's political course around back to where it should be. She has an opportunity, if she's lucky, if she has the right kind of support, to be the Republican candidate in 2024. And she would be running then, think about this as a campaign. Harris against Cheney. Two women, very accomplished, representing the best in their parties. That kind of race would allow me to take a very, very deep breath and smile for a long time, which I have not been doing terribly much in the last couple of years. I went on and I'm sorry to.
A lot of ifs in that scenario.
Oh, I know, a lot indeed.
Including the sitting president not running again.
John, supposing she loses next year.
Yeah.
That becomes confirmation
Absolutely.
that Trump has taken over a major political party. He already has.
I think we already have that confirmation. Yeah.
Exactly. exactly.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, please.
No, that's
More
okay.
questions?
You touched on U.S.-China a bit. Curious of your observations of today's U.S.-China cold relations and advice you would offer to President Biden and Chairman Xi.
Well, what happened in China yesterday is a very depressing thought, but it's a fact, and it shouldn't be a surprise that the Chinese Communist Party uh, uh, has elected Xi for a lifetime. He is our lifetime leader. So he's the guy you've got to deal with. Biden has said many, many times that when he was vice president, he had occasion to talk to Xi, who was then not the leader, but one of the rising young men on the block. And Biden seems to feel that he knows him and can talk to him. Well, if that is the case, I would raise question number one. China and the United States have never fought a war. There is no collision of basic national interest on either side looking toward a conflict as the way to resolve it. Number two, there has always been in American history, really since the Yankee clipper ships of the early part of the 19th century, going off to China, that were dealing with religion, that were dealing with New England products. The whole idea with China has been to open it up to the West. Now, that was a little presumptuous on our part, but nevertheless, it was an effort to open China to the West. And it seems to me that a policy that continues to be rooted in an anti-Chinese direction, which is where we are now. Everything is anti-China. The other day at Glasgow, China and the United States, much to everyone's surprise, said, hey, we've got something in common in trying to head off disaster. That was a big step forward on an issue that is not in collision with economic competition at all. It is something that could help both societies. So there is a possibility of finding those elements out there: pandemic, climate change, science in general, that the Chinese have a great reservoir of talent, as do we. And we could use it together for the benefit, really, of the entire world. In other words, I don't think we should continue this relentless anti-China emphasis in our policy. Ease up. We're not going to give away the kitchen sink. We're pretty smart about what is in our national interest. And let's play that card rather than an antagonistic negative card, which I don't think has ever worked well. It didn't work well during the Cold War with Russia, and it certainly is not working well now.
I know we're near the end of the hour, but one final question, and this is probably way too long of an answer from you to try to get into this fully, but how do we regain trust in journalism?
Oh, wow. That I am not sure about. I am not sure about, because I'm sure of one thing. A free press is fundamental to the continuation of a free, open, democratic society. Without a free press, wrap it up, it ain't gonna happen. But if you have still the promise of a free press, we have then the promise of political democracy, and that's very essential. What can we do, however, to reestablish trust? I honestly don't know. I wish I had a quick answer for that, but I don't, by my inability to answer the question, mean to suggest that what I represented is great, and what these guys represent today is not. There are great journalists today in almost every outfit, but the environment in which they work, the pursuit of profit over anything, over a good story, That is unacceptable. And somehow or another, that pursuit of profit is where it began to go south. It's the reason Murrow quit in 1961 and went to work for John F. Kennedy, because he couldn't stand any longer the cheapness which began to infiltrate itself into the presentation of the news. In Murrow's mind, it was an almost a sacred obligation that you had to tell the truth as best you knew it. And today you've got a world where Fox television is doing its thing, and the New York Times is doing its thing, and it seems as if it's two separate universes. And it is, but it isn't. It's part of the same political system in somehow or other. And I don't know how, but I'd love to think seriously about that and not think so seriously about Khrushchev's Russia. But that's a huge question. Thank you for it, and my apologies for not being able to answer it.
Thank you so much, Marvin the Great. This was a wonderful discussion. So I have shared a link to your book in the chat, and I hope that all of our viewers will pick it up. I think it sounds like your life has been incredibly fascinating, and we can learn a lot from it. So
thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And John, I'll turn this back over to you. Thank you.
John, thank you. Great to talk to you again.
Well, thank you again, Marvin, and just to echo what Jessica said, just fascinating stuff, incredibly thoughtful. And maybe we have yet another book after you write the one on the Cuban Missile Crisis and that period of time, which is how we right this ship. So with that, I just want to thank you. I want to thank World Affairs Council, Town Hall, Chevalier's Bookstore, and until next time, take care and have a great Thanksgiving.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much.
Kim's coming back.
Ambassador Emerson and Marvin Kalb, this was just such a mesmerizing conversation, and I agree wholeheartedly with the ambassador that we need to bring you back. We need more time with you, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you so much.
And thank you so much for moderating again, John. That was just superb. Thank you both so very much for your time, and have a great holiday, because we won't see you between now and then.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye, everybody.
For our home audience, we have a terrific lineup of upcoming programs. Next week, a roundtable discussion with Commissioner Jamie Lee. She's the Commissioner of the Port of Los Angeles, and this will be focusing on the supply chain issues. On the 18th, Blockbuster or Bust. This is a new lesson in the film industry with industry insider and expert Kevin Getz, who's also a member of our board of directors. He's a fascinating insider on the movie industry, so you won't want to miss that. On December 2nd, the role of higher education in California's future with University of California President Michael Drake. And of course, every Tuesday, politics in the time of coronavirus at 5 p.m. Please go to our website at lawacth.org. Sign up today. You can view past programs. You can become a member, make a donation. Just get involved. We love having you here. Please stay safe, stay informed, and we'll see you next week. Thank you.